Welcome to another episode of the GayBarchives show, where we explore gay history one bar at a time. I'm your host, Art Smith, and our guest today is writer, historian, and co-founder of Chicago's Legacy Project, Owen Keehnen. So welcome to the show, Owen.
Thank you.
You're quite welcome. So I know if we really wanted to dig into your knowledge of Chicago's bar history, we would probably spend a week or more of nonstop conversation. I know you've got a lot of stories to tell, but
thank you.
As a prolific author and historian and being involved with co-founding the Legacy Project, you have certainly uncovered a lot of information about Chicago's history. So where do you want to start? What do you want to talk about?
I'm sorry?
Where do you want to start? What bar do you want to talk about first?
You know, I think the first bar I really would like to talk about that made a huge impression on me. I think it was probably the second gay bar I went to, but it was a place called the Stage Door Disco in Rockford, Illinois. And it was just, I was so excited because it felt like such a gay experience. And I was really hungry for those. I wanted to be a part of something. And the stage door sort of was a peek inside the door, but it was fun. It was fun. I ended up dating the DJ, which is, of course, I had arrived, when that happens. but the bar that really made the big impression on me, that made me not just peek through that doorway, but step inside, was Irene's Cabaret down in Quincy, Illinois. And that place was just, I went there and it was so magical to me because I had sort of this concept of I knew what being gay was. That didn't surprise me, but I didn't know that being gay could also mean being part of a community. And Irene's Cabaret was like that. I mean, with a place, let me take a mental video camera for you. So we're walking down 5th Street in Quincy, Illinois. On the street front, it's completely boarded up, painted black, and a sign that says, "Enter in rear." So then you go around to the alley, and there's a sign on this back door that says, "Irene's Cabaret, enter here." So you go in, there's a long hallway with the bathrooms on the left. Then it goes into a game room that has a couple pool tables and a sitting area and other things, like little other couches and things. Then you go through another doorway and there's the main bar, which is, Irene was very particular about lighting. So it was very dim and it was violet lighting and mirrors on the left wall and mirrors on the right wall and Grecian statuary with boas. I mean, it was a gay bar. And then you went through that room, and there was a jukebox on the right with a pretty good sized dance floor, and and then a seating area, a big seating area that was basically like restaurant surplus sort of seating. But the place was so magical. I mean, Irene, whose real name was Willie, ran the place, and it was like this exercise in incredible gayness, and as just the place was just immersed in Willie's personality. And that, like the jukebox was like, it was Della Reese, and it was I'm trying to think of something. The musical selection, you got the feeling, was not somebody from a jukebox company coming around and putting records in there, but actually like 45s from Irene's collection at home. And Irene ran this place with, when I was there, this was the early 80s, with his, he said it was his nephew. He was probably like 30 years old and had like this, like Daryl Hall, no, John Oates, like John Oates hair, like a big black kind of perm thing. And his name, by the way, was Horetta, was what Irene would always call this manager of the place. And it was so much fun. They were so liberating, because Quincy's a town of like 40,000. And Irene and Horetta would just, they would downplay nothing. And they brought that to the bar. And the bar was this only place in this, a pretty big radius. I mean, there was Springfield to the east, and there was St. Louis to the south. But other than that, in that sort of area, it was Irene's Cabaret. And so because of that, the bar was leathermen and drag queens and blue collar workers and farmers and a lot of women. And it was a very mixed environment. And the thing is that no matter how different everybody was, everybody got along so well. You might not know everybody's name, but the people there had your back.
Yeah.
And to have that sort of feeling in a bar was just, it was like this light bulb went off for me.
Especially when we're talking about, the time frame that we are, which, like you said, was the early 80s. Mm-hmm. Irene's was a fairly new bar at that time. I believe they opened actually in 1980. And they continued to operate for 36 years. They only closed a few years ago in 2016.
When I read that, I literally got teary. And I'm not kidding. But the most shocking part of what you just said, I probably went there starting in 81. So that place was open a year. It looked like it could have been there for 50 years. I mean, it had the feel of like this riverboat brothel where everything was like red and flocked wallpaper and the mirrors and stuff. It was so over the top. I could not have loved it more. Yeah. And the thing is it was such a reflection of the personality of the owner. This wasn't like somebody else. This was a queer-owned bar. And the great kudo to this story was that I lived above this music store on Main Street in Quincy. And I was on the top floor and I had access to the roof. So in the summer, the best place to lay was on the roof of the building. And I could look down into the backyard of Willie, whose his yard sort of was right behind me. And he and Horetta would be out there all day if it was sunny. And they'd be, iodine and baby oil and just like an album cover with aluminum foil. And they would just be out there just smoking and gossiping and flipping through like tabloids. They were absolutely incredible. I was mesmerized by them because I'd met people in Quincy who were gay, but it was very different. You know, it was very like a lot of the gay community there outside the bar was sort of very not closeted, but very low key. So that was my first kind of big time exposure to somebody who just had no interest in what anybody else did or thought.
To put it into perspective for people who are thinking, well, you know, we're talking about Chicago. No.
That's Quincy, Illinois.
Quincy is about 5 hours southwest of Chicago. Mm-hmm. So it's not next door to Chicago. It's not a suburb of Chicago. It's a town of 35 to 40,000 people. Now, I don't know what it was then. And we're talking about 40 years ago. I mean, this is a time when a lot of places you could easily gotten mugged or beaten up or lost your job or thrown out of your house or whatever for being gay. And from what I understand, the pictures I've seen, Willie, known as Irene West, I think was his drag name, but Willard Kaufman was the owner, and he was a tall guy, wasn't he? He wasn't like some little diminutive drag queen. The pictures I see, he kind of towers above the people in the picture with him.
Very tall and lean.
And
they were both very, the body type of that era was very, you know, that trim, very, very trim.
Now, were you still there in 1984 or had you moved away from by then?
I was still there.
So you remember one of the stories I discovered about Irene's when I was doing a little research is in 1984, Irene, a.k.a. Willie, was robbed, beaten, and left for dead at his home.
Horrible. I remember that.
So there was another connection of, you know, a situation of a gay bar where the owner or drag queen, depending on how the perpetrator looked at it, but a gay person who was prominent in the community was robbed and beaten. And literally, from what I remember from the story, he had some damage to his vision and he was permanently deaf in one ear after that. So it was a severe beating. It wasn't, you know.
It was horrible. I was still living in Quincy at that time, but I had, I was away from Quincy for probably 4 or 5 months there, and it happened during that period. And the thing is that was so incredibly heartbreaking that, but you know what? Willie went back. Willie didn't sell the place, you know. That's the incredible thing. Willie went on to keep owning that bar for almost 30 more years, you know, after that happened. It was just horrible because that bar felt really safe, you know, and when that happened, it sort of was like one of those things that shakes you and say, you know, I wish the world were as cool as the bar was, you know.
Yeah, and we were a resilient community then. We're about the same age, and I was having my first gay experiences around the same time. I think the actual first gay bar I went to was in 1978. And so I know exactly what the vibe was then. And it was definitely different. So after Irene's Cabaret, is that around the time you moved to Chicago, mid-'80s?
Yes. Yes, I left Quincy and came to Chicago. And Chicago was a whole different scene, you know? Um, I was so thrilled to be here, because I was entering the world. I can't think of anything better way to describe this, but I was like entering the world of After Dark magazine, um, which had always been a fantasy and a focal point for me. Um, just to be able to sort of see that kind of bar culture and nightlife activity reflected um, in culture in general, to be able to look through a magazine and see that. And so when I came to Chicago, it was just this immersion in this incredibly wonderful world. And the main thing that I resented, though, was the fact that it was, I resented's the wrong word. I regretted the fact that I had missed a lot of the heyday of the great bars, because in 1985 was sort of when things started changing with the nightlife scene, because of the rise of HIV and AIDS. So the great Chicago bars I'd fantasized about, were still around, or actually, let me rephrase that. One of the bars that was no longer still around, that I had heard about and always fantasized about, was Dugan's Bistro, which was around from 1973 to 1982. And it was a groundbreaking disco. I mean, it was often called the Studio 54 of the Midwest, but it predated Studio 54 by 4 years. And the bistro was a just very gay disco that bridged into the mainstream. It was outrageous, and it was decadent, and it was disco, and it hit in 1973. The timing was perfect, and it just took off. It had the right level of absurdity and abandon. And the thing that made the timing so right is in the early years of gay liberation, in the early 70s, there was such just, after so many years of repression, the overwhelming feeling among people was just to celebrate. And so the celebration became this huge party, and Dugan's Bistro was sort of the epicenter of that. It attracted celebrities. It was all about outrageousness. I wrote a book about it. I became so obsessed about it, called Dugan's Bistro and the Legend of the Bearded Lady. And that was one of the times when one of the great things that I enjoy about writing, and especially writing about something like this that I didn't get the chance to experience, is I can hear people's stories, and I can read newspaper articles, and I can see pictures, and I can sort of piece together that environment. And what I try to do, both for myself and for the reader, is make it into this kind of like time travel, like the ability to experience as fully as possible an LGBTQ experience that, due to timing, you were never able to encounter firsthand. So it was such an incredible writing experience. I mean, the great thing about interviewing someone for a project like that is you can ask all the questions that you want to ask about a place like that. And you're asking it of people who experienced it firsthand. And they want to share that. They want to talk about it. They want that history preserved. And it's so fun to be part of that, that time capsule kind of process. So yeah, the bistro was just, it was so much fun to work on. And the bar was so important and groundbreaking for so many of the things in disco. And the sad thing is that what often happens in Chicago and Milwaukee and Detroit and Atlanta and other places is that, especially for the time period, there was a really big focus on New York, San Francisco, and LA. And so a lot of the history of those other cities is kind of basically left to fall between the cracks. And so that's why it's important to do things like what you're doing with this podcast to preserve these stories that are basically in people's memories, that are social history, which are such a big part of people's lives, but that haven't really been contained. They're not news stories per se. So doing this and keeping that part of our history is so important. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, it's the best way to connect with young people. You know, I mean, it's hard to understand maybe how it was to experience being part of a big court case or something that's enormous. But it's very easy to understand going out with your friends and what you did to have fun. And I think that's a real opportunity for understanding. And it's part of the history that we need to pass down.
I agree. And it's been an incredible journey for me. I've done almost 100 of these interviews now. So we're talking about probably 95 hours of video in its edited form. And I have interviewed people of all different ages from all different places. The most distant memory, first person memory that I've captured so far is a man who used to own some bars in Atlanta. His name was Ted Binkley. Mm-hmm. He later moved to Alabama and owned a bar there. And he tells about his first bar experience before he was legally old enough to go to a bar in Nashville, Tennessee in 1952. Think about that, 70 years ago. And he's here to tell us about it. So that's one of the reasons I feel it's so important to capture some of these stories, because the people that lived the experiences in these bars, especially the ones from the 50s and 60s, they're not going to be around forever. And if we don't capture them now, they're, you know, as you know, back then, we did not walk into a bar with a camera or a video recorder or anything. So there are very few pictures other than some of the maybe local newspapers that may have occasionally captured one, or in some rare exceptions, some local photographer who just had a passion for taking pictures of, you know, drag queens and discos, and they captured them. But it is sad that so many of the smaller cities did not have the opportunity that New York did, because when you talk about clubs like Studio 54 was open for like 15 minutes. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it was a flash in the pan compared to these other bars, some of which lasted, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And nobody knows much about.
I agree with what you're saying, but I will also say that Studio 54 was like, it was the moment, you know, it wasn't open long, but it was like, it was the place. But yeah, it would be nice to sort of divvy up the attention a little bit. And I think part of this too is like, it's as you age, I think looking back on history, one of the things about LGBTQ history that I kind of would like to do with my work, and that have been trying to go in that direction, is that especially our recent history is Stonewall riots, AIDS, gay marriage, now. And it's literally like you're standing there skipping a stone over the side of a lake. And, those things are all really important, but there's a whole lake underneath that is kind of in my opinion, kind of the real story, is sort of the undercurrent of what people were doing while all those things were going on,
Right.
And so much of that history, unlike, the big events, haven't been chronicled, and that's what's important.
Well, and so much of where we are today as a community can be attributed to the things that happened in conjunction with or physically at the bars and nightclubs in the time frame between Stonewall and the late 90s. There's so many of our organizations that we're relying upon to fight for our rights and to push these agendas in state and national legislatures and what have you, all formed as a result of fundraisers that were done by drag queens and bar owners around the country, people who gathered there for meetings. They played such an integral part in where we have gotten today. And yet a lot of that is just brushed aside.
Well, and I think it's also not emphasized enough in the pre-computer age that bars were also centers for communication. Bars were centers for organizing. Like, I think here about the Anita Bryant protests. Those protests were organized by the bars, who ran shuttle buses down to the event. And there was that sort of interaction between bars and community. Like the bars were at that point where they were being owned by LGBTQ people. So they became much more politically involved. A lot of times the bars were involved because the people who worked and owned the bars were kind of the out people in the community that a lot of times people weren't out in.
Now, you had mentioned, one of the important bars that you had never had the chance to visit was Dugan's Bistro. What was that physically like? Was that a big bar? Did it have a huge dance floor? Was it flashy, or was it just a bar?
It wasn't huge. It didn't have an enormous ceiling. It didn't have a high ceiling, I mean. It just had a certain magic. And a big part of that magic was Eddie Dugan, who had this just incredible personality and this great sense of the outrageous. He had the sort of personality where he could walk up to you in the bar and greet you and be like, "Hi, how you doing? I'm so glad you're here." And people would talk about making you feel that like he was so happy you were there, and you were the reason, like he was, up tonight and all that. And then he could go on and just do that with everyone and just make everyone feel so happy to be there. And one of the things he did too, which was amazing, is he knew word of mouth, and he knew what people would talk about, So he would do things like have a drag queen get up on the bar in the middle of the evening and just kick all the glasses and napkins and everything else off the bar and just cause a big ruckus. And then Eddie would just replace everyone's drinks, and it would just be kind of this outrageous thing that happened at the bistro that people would talk about the next day. And that was actually how I got started in this, was just hearing those stories about just those crazy things that because of insurance today, you can't even imagine a bar doing. For one of Eddie's birthday parties, they had a hole cut in the ceiling. He was lowered from this is above the dance floor, was lowered from the ceiling into an empty bathtub, then had, in the middle of the dance floor, then had half-naked go-go boys come out and fill the bathtub with champagne. Another time, yeah, just insane things that just couldn't be done today. You know, it was an era of abandon and, like I said, outrageousness. You know, and then the other thing that attracted me to the whole project was the fact of the bearded lady becoming this celebrity. And the bearded lady was something else that people talked about when they left the bar. It was something else in Chicago that you had to see, something else that made the bistro cross over and be listed in, you know, things to do in the Tribune and have it be visited by members of the Rolling Stones or Diana Ross or Ted Kennedy or whoever. You know, it was a celebrity magnet. You know, it sort of was at that point where it was one of those gay bars that became bigger. And there wasn't a lot of that before then. There wasn't a lot of that where the community was, where the larger community, I should say, came onto our turf. Because that was another thing that Eddie was adamant about, was that despite the mainstreaming of the bistro, it was going to still be very much a gay bar. He did not want to change that at all, to such a degree that if too many straight people were in there, he would have people, you know, go just be sexually outrageous on the dance floor just to sort of shock them. You know, he did not want any, you know, he did not want mainstreaming at that cost.
Sounds like he was definitely ahead of his time. And I would definitely recommend to anybody who's listening to this podcast to go ahead and look for a copy of Dugan's Bistro and the Legend of the Bearded Lady. So you get to hear a lot more of these stories and hear a lot more about Dugan's, because we'd be here all day talking about that bar.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know. I just start talking about it. And like I said, this is another project that was just a labor of love. It was sort of starting to hear those stories and be like, okay, stop everything. This is something that, you know, needs to get written down. Plus, I kind of want to go on this time travel. Like, it was a fun place to spend my time, you know, while I was working on the book.
I understand. And, you know, my whole project is about connecting all these people and these stories. In addition to the video segments like this, I have a page on my website, on the GayBarchives website, that is called Archives. And on that page, I list links to as many of the LGBT archives websites that I could find, some international, some national, and then they're broken down by state for the ones that are specific to individual states and cities. Because doing the research, and I'm sure you came across the same issue, nothing is integrated. You know, the University of Chicago doesn't tell you what the University of Illinois has, or that they even have an archive. So I tried to make a master list, and I've got well over 100 archives listed there from around the country and a few international. So I you know, don't intend to capture everybody's story, but at least try to connect people where they can find the stories like the one you wrote about Dugan's Bistro. It's out there. So, you know.
And that's such an important tool that you're providing, because it really is. It's so much of the research is not in mainstream periodicals either. You know, a lot of times it's papers that were smaller or local, or, you know, bar rags or whatever that that make research tough. So LGBTQ archives in general, like here we're very fortunate. We have Gerber Hart Library and Archives, and we also have the Leather Museum and Archives, or Leather Archives and Museum, I'm sorry. And those two sources have been an incredible help on any work I've done here.
And they're both listed on my archives page.
And thank you for that. Thank you for that, because a lot of times people don't realize how incredible these local resources are and how necessary, is the other thing. And also, as long as we're talking about it, for whoever is listening to this, please make sure that if you have papers or magazines or newspaper articles or matchbooks or whatever that's part of the LGBTQ story, please make some sort of arrangement that those will go to an archive someday or something like that, because it might not seem like a big deal, but it's all part of a bigger story. So that's also a great resource that you provided, where people can find out places where they might be able to contribute to their local archive or museum.
Okay. So are there any other Chicago bars you want to talk about, or?
Well, one of the other ones that I am going back to the bistro and legendary bars in Chicago that I regret never going to, but am obsessed by and writing about, is the Gold Coast, which was the legendary leather bar in Chicago, mostly at 501 North Clark Street. And it too was a groundbreaking bar. I mean, it was the bar that spawned the International Mr. Leather contest. It was adorned with the erotic artwork of Etienne, who was co-owner of the Gold Coast with Dom Orjudos, who was co-owner of the Gold Coast with Chuck Renslow, who was his life partner. And it had a pit that was like an anything goes pit, like a sexual wonderland. And in the pit, there was a jail cell that was, it was called the Leather Cell, that was a custom-made leather works. And I believe the first leather sling was on display in that actual jail cell that was down there. The Gold Coast is another sort of level of decadence that just I'm completely mesmerized by. And I've written about it. I wrote with Tracy Bain. I did a few bios, and one of them was Leatherman, the legend of Chuck Renslow. And I wrote about Gold Coast quite a bit there, and I was so interested in it. But I kind of, when writing about this period, I kind of thought writing about the Gold Coast might not be as important, maybe, as writing about Chuck's other big business at the time, which was Man's Country Bathhouse in Chicago. So that's my current project. I'm writing about the heyday of the golden era of bathhouses, and charting how Man's Country played a part in the community, how it was important for the development of the community, how it evolved, and what incredible performers performed there in the music hall, how it was just this wonderland, of offering gay men more than just the kind of towel and key sort of bathhouse. And it's just charting the course of that and seeing, the heyday of bathhouses and just how important it was, and the dawn of AIDS and the decline of the bathhouses, and how Man's Country in Chicago remained open through that because of its connection with STD testing, which, you know, extends back to the mid 70s, and having a clinic on site to test for venereal disease. And having Wanda Lust, who was the resident DJ and drag queen and manager of the music hall, dress up as a nurse and become Nurse Lust to promote STD testing, you know, to the degree where even a mobile STD unit was launched called the VD van, which literally drove around, would park outside popular bar areas, and then Wanda Lust, dressed as Nurse Lust, so probably, you know, 6'7" in heels and hair, would run into the bars and try to get people to come out and get tested for STDs. And the idea might seem, you know, crazy, but the thing is that VD van in its first week on the streets got 1,000 people tested for STDs, which is enormous. So there's so many side stories with Man's Country, and you know, then through AIDS, how it was, how parts of it were walled off and became, first of all, the big nightclub Bistro 2, and then the building was reconfigured again, and part of it became the Chicago Eagle. And the fact that in its heyday, Man's Country had a country store. It had, like, literally a store within the bathhouse, a country store with a display window and everything. It had, you know, earlier that store had been called Erogenous Zones that sold, you know, different things you might use at a bathhouse. And there's just such a rich culture there that I wanted to write about, because I think it's easy to look back on bathhouses as just, they become very sort of vilified and demonized, meaning the heyday of bathhouses, that they're seen as something not as glorious as maybe what they were to the people at the time, which again was all about sexual abandon, sexual exploration, sexual liberation, and how being able to do that at that period was a political act. Like, we haven't been able to do this. Now we're doing it in a place that's set aside for this.
Absolutely. You know, and every time I posted something in my GayBarchives group, which really surprised me. When I started the GayBarchives group on Facebook, maybe not even a year and a half ago, I had no great hopes that it was going to become very popular. I didn't know what to expect. But now we have over 5,500 members, and they love talking about gay bar history from all over the country. And every time I've posted anything about Man's Country, people come out of the woodwork. I mean, they're like, oh my God, I had such great times. I met my husband there. I used to go there every Saturday. I practically lived there. You know. Well,
one of the things we forget, like, Man's Country was a place where this was the place to go with your friends after the bars closed. This was a place to continue the bar party. There were people who would go there and, like, go there for the weekend. Like, they would bring beads to hang in the doorway. They would bring, you know, decor. It was much more social and much more of an experience than I think bathhouses are seen as. I mean, some of the performers there, I mean, it was incredible. There was Waylon Flowers and Madam, Charles Bush, Rusty Warren, Pudgy, like all these incredible acts. And then when it became Bistro 2, you know, Divine performed there in one of their final performances, club performances. The Village People performed there. Boy George performed there. And then you have the history of the Chicago Eagle, which is a whole nother story, of just of the evolution of community.
Well, as you're working on this book and talking about this, there are two people I've interviewed that come to mind who have expressed memories of stories about that general scene in Chicago back in the day. And one of them is the owner of a really cool store in San Francisco called Autoerotica.
Oh, yeah. I know Pat. Is this Pat?
Yeah, Pat. He obviously was connected with Chuck and with that whole scene. And the other one, I don't know if you've talked to at all, but until I interviewed him, I didn't realize he had a Chicago connection. And that was Bruce Valanche.
You know what? I'm talking to him later today.
Well, tell him I said hi. Tell him I said hello. We had a fabulous time a couple months ago in Fort Lauderdale at his show, and then at a couple of clubs there. And I interviewed him. He was an early interview, probably a year ago in this series.
Well, what I'm fascinated about to talk to him about is he wrote about a column about Man's Country being the spa to go to for the Chicago Tribune in 1975.
Yep.
But then, but then he also played meaning performed at the music hall at Man's Country too. So it'll be fun to get a lot of different perspectives.
And he also has the bathhouse connection with writing for Bette Midler and Barry Manilow when they were performing in the bathhouse circuit. So yeah, he's definitely going to be an interesting person to talk to about this whole scenario.
Oh, I love talking about the golden era of this. Something else I wanted to mention about that is so key to Man's Country and to get the visual is that going back to Chuck's lover and life partner being Dom, who was also the erotic artist Etienne, who's sort of Tama Finland and Tama Finland in my mind are sort of the iconic too. And so Etienne, Dom, did these incredible murals to both sides going up the stairway where it looks like these hot men are going up the stairs to either side of you. At the top of the stairs, he did this incredible mural of, it said the music hall, and it had like a naked muse, I guess, playing a lyre. I'm not sure if you pronounce it that way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Lyre. There was that. Chuck Renslow was also previously in the 1950s the owner of Chris Studios, which was one of the big like male physique photography studios. So there were these incredible framed photos, professional photos of a lot of his artwork in the hallways as well, combined with, different Dom murals. There was this incredible painting that's in the Leather Archives and Museum now that was in the locker room that's very long. It's called like Car Wash or something like that. That's incredible. But then there were also posters, like a signed poster from Sally Rand and a signed poster from Charles Pierce. And it was a lot more than a bathhouse. And that's kind of the point I want to get across, is that this is another fragile history. And this is a history that's also a lot of times shrouded in shame or something that people shouldn't talk about, right. Which a lot of times as a historian means that's exactly what you know.
Right. People have said the same thing to me, because I've included bathhouses in the list of bars or venues or whatever. And people have said, well, that's not really a bar. And I'm like, well, it's just as important. It was, a very critical part of the evolution of the community. And in some places, it was the only part. Some places there were no bars so to speak, but there were bathhouses or some other, Atlanta had one called the Locker Room that nobody could decide if it was a show bar or a bathhouse or a gym or what it was supposed to be. But they played an important role in the evolution of the community at a time when it was very tenuous. I mean, before that point, when you go back into the 50s and 60s, so much of our nightlife was controlled by, I hate to use the word, but by, mafia types and people who were taking advantage of the financial position. They could, put out a bar, they could keep the police away long enough to make a lot of money on them. And they weren't really in the best interest of the community. Once we started seeing the bathhouses and some of the newer bars that evolved in the 70s and 80s, then we started getting into our own right of having, our own community stations. Right.
They became, and yeah, I agree that like gay bars are really out important focus. But I think like as a bigger way to inclusive way is sort of like queer space in general. Like even if the bar doesn't exist, there's the need for, like here in Chicago, another big place that I've enjoyed doing history about is the Belmont Rocks, which were this outdoor queer space that existed in Chicago from the early 1960s until they were bulldozed in 2003. And these were just these were a place we could go and be out and LGBTQ and ourselves in the sunshine in the middle of the city at a time when our bars still had, didn't have windows, or if they did have windows, they were painted black.
Right.
And the importance of those places, like you said, with more than just bars, but there has to be somewhere.
Absolutely. And so I try to include as much as I can about these different kind of places in my project as well. And I really appreciate the kind of work that you're doing. I mean, obviously in the writing portion of your career, you've documented numerous bars, you've put out a lot of information, preserved a lot of information that might have otherwise been lost. And obviously at this point, you're working on another book that's going to be yet another addition to our massive collection of knowledge about what's going on or what went on in the gay scene around the country. But you also, as I mentioned in your introduction, are one of the co-founders of the Legacy Project, which is another important thing in a physical manifestation of our gay history right in the middle of Boys Town and throughout Chicago, preserving that history. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the Legacy Project is and what you do?
Sure. Well, actually, they changed now it's called North Halsted.
Right.
So on North Halsted, there are these enormous rainbow pylons. And on the sides of the pylons are affixed these bronze plaques of various LGBTQ people in history and worldwide. And so it's this outdoor walking history museum celebrating LGBTQ history. It's educational. It has a big educational element. It's expanded now where there's the Legacy Wall, which is an expanded version of what you see on the North Halsted streetscape that includes much more information and is available for travel. So a lot of times, different hospitals or schools or whatever, or state buildings will have it in their lobby as an educational tool. And this is the brainchild of Victor Salvo. I'm a co-founder, but along with Lori Cannon. But this is basically being a co-founder is truthfully being Victor's lieutenant in this. I mean, I do a lot of the biographies that are written, But it's Victor who's really taken this project to a whole nother level.
As I mentioned to another one of your comrades up there, Rick Carlin, it's an honor just to play the smallest role in this project in the grand scheme of things, because collectively, I have met and spoken to so many people that are doing such a great job, but nobody can do it all. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of cities and tens of thousands of bars across the country that need their memories preserved and the stories told. And we all just need to work together and do our part, whatever part we can do. And eventually there will be an entire, collective history of what, the gay community experienced and what we had over the decades. So it's great to play as just even a small part.
Well, and with the work you're doing too, I think it's incredibly crucial to be doing this now at a time when not only our history, but our very identities are being threatened to be wiped away. The don't say gay issues, are horrific. And I think we really need to, part of entrenching ourselves and saying we're not going anywhere is to show that this has a history. This isn't something that came about. This was something that was always here and was allowed to flourish, that our history is part of the bigger history, and that we're not going back into the closet, basically.
I somehow have this vision of, I think it was the old ACT UP phrase coming back. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of feel like we're at a point where that's coming back into our lives, and we need to, stand up and pronounce the fact that we're not going anywhere. So,
because all these things that all these pioneers and, so many of the people you cover in your bar history, those people fought, for the freedoms to do all this stuff. And it's very tenuous, it can be taken away really easily. And I think the best way to honor that and to honor our legacy is to just make sure that nothing happens to our past.
Absolutely. And I want to invite you to share any of the information you have about, any of the LGBT icons from the past, or the Dugan's Bistro, your book on Man's Country, any of that kind of stuff in the GayBarchives group, and use that as an additional tool to, interact with people and to reach out, because that's what the group is there for. And that's what those 5,500 people are looking for. They want to interact with people about our gay history. So, please feel free to use it.
Oh, it's so important. And you mentioned Rick Carlin earlier, and I am so excited that Rick Carlin and Suki Delacroix are releasing Last Call, which is this encyclopedia of Chicago bars that's coming out later this summer, early fall. And the fact that that book exists is just, truthfully, in my heart, I go,
I know, I agree. When I spoke to Rick last year, and he sent me a list of, I think at the time they had cataloged 700 bars that used to exist in Chicago.
Oh my God.
And now the Last Call Chicago actually cataloged 1,001 LGBT friendly venues from Chicago's history. So they've added another 300. Just amazing. And it's so refreshing to know that those people are out there doing this kind of work. So,
and not only, and yeah, I mean, doing that kind of work, and that, like, just wrap your head around that. Like 1,001 bars. Like, that's crazy. I mean, what do we have now? I mean, I don't know, 25 maybe, a couple dozen, you know, and it's, I mean, that number just blows me away.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the books that you've worked on, about your memories from Illinois bar history, and for everything that you do with the Legacy Project. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. And thank you, actually, for what you're doing is another one of those things that I see being done. And again, with the Rick Carlin and Suki book, I just go, oh, that it's work that like makes my heart happy to see happening. So thank you really for this and for this opportunity to even, you know, to share my history.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
That concludes another episode of the GayBarchives Show. For more information about this episode or to find more episodes, visit GayBarchives.com.